anyone is listening to that other than the person on the other line and staffers. The fact that he says that there says to me that he realizes day one with his hand on the Bible, wow, I have written a check that I cannot possibly cash.
I read that transcript again today, too, and what's amazing is that Peña Nieto is saying, you know, Mr. President, you know that Mexico will never pay for the wall. That is never going to happen. And the initial response from Trump to that is, you cannot tell the press that. You cannot tell the press that. Like, help me maintain this fiction.
Keep the magic nonsense going.
Yes.
Like, we'll be collaborators on the magic nonsense.
So the question, I mean, maybe the way out of this is that Democrats can come up with a way, or actually makes more sense if Republicans come up with a way to just allow Trump to declare that he won and he got the money and the wall's being built. Just let him have his unicorn. Just say it's true when it's not. He can campaign on it all he wants. I'm not sure that it matters to him whether or not it actually happens. I absolutely think
really a wall to begin with.
And none of that's true, but we all just agree to say it so that the issue goes away and the government can reopen.
Rachel, it's been great to have you here on All In. Come by anytime.
Thank you. It has been, as you say, it's sort of a strange news day, but it's nice to be here with you, my friend.
All right. We are less than 2 minutes from this president's primetime address in the Oval Office, and so the Rachel Maddow Show starts right now.
I want to thank all of you at home for joining us this hour. Very happy to have you with us. Let me give you a sense of how the next hour is going to go. President Trump's first primetime address from the Oval Office will start momentarily. We are expecting it to be short, under 10 minutes. Then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer are going to give a rebuttal on behalf of the Democratic Party. That should follow very quickly after the end of the president's speech. After that, here this hour, we're going to have some expert help in sorting out the claims made in those various speeches. We will also hear from freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's going to be joining us live for her first interview on this show. But we also tonight are going to be talking about the tons of news that broke today that I think the White House was hoping would be wiped out by this primetime speech. The Russian lawyer who offered Donald Trump Jr. dirt on Hillary Clinton and then met with Trump campaign officials in Trump Tower during the campaign, she was indicted today. Lawyers for the president's campaign chair, Paul Manafort, today accidentally revealed a spy novel's worth of new details about Manafort's links to Russia. There were 2 new plot twists in a mystery case that's been conducted under seal involving special counsel Robert Mueller, including one twist from the Supreme Court today. We're going to be covering all of that over the course of the hour. That all happened today, just as the news cycle is jammed up with tonight's presidential first, his first primetime Oval Office address. Here is the president live from the Oval Office. Again, we believe this will be about 10 minutes.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. But all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico. Women or children are the biggest victims, by far, of our broken system. This is the tragic reality of illegal immigration on our southern border. This is the cycle of human suffering that I am determined to end. My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe. In fact, safer than ever before. The proposal from Homeland Security includes cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy. Our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense. The border wall would very quickly pay for itself. The cost of illegal drugs exceeds $500 billion a year, vastly more than the $5.7 billion we have requested from Congress. The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico. Senator Chuck Schumer, who you will be hearing from later tonight, has repeatedly supported a physical barrier in the past, along with many other Democrats. They changed their mind only after I was elected president. Democrats in Congress have refused to acknowledge the crisis, and they have refused to provide our brave border agents with the tools they desperately need to protect our families and our nation. The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation. But the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government. This situation could be solved in a 45-minute meeting. I have invited congressional leadership to the White House tomorrow to get this done. Hopefully, we can rise above partisan politics in order to support national security. Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside. The only thing that is immoral is the politicians to do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. America's heart broke the day after Christmas when a young police officer in California was savagely murdered in cold blood by an illegal alien who just came across the border. The life of an American hero was stolen by someone who had no right to be in our country. Day after day, precious lives are cut short by those who have violated our borders. In California, an Air Force veteran was raped, murdered, and beaten to death with a hammer by an illegal alien with a long criminal history. In Georgia, an illegal alien was recently charged with murder for killing, beheading, and dismembering his neighbor. In Maryland, MS-13 gang members who arrived in the United States as unaccompanied minors were arrested and charged last year after viciously stabbing and beating a 16-year-old girl. Over the last several years, I've met with dozens of families whose loved ones were stolen by illegal immigration. I've held the hands of the weeping mothers and embraced the grief-stricken fathers. So sad, so terrible. I will never forget the pain in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, and the sadness gripping their souls. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? To those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. This is a choice between right and wrong, justice and injustice. This is about whether we fulfill our sacred duty to the American citizens we serve. When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do. So help me God. Thank you and good night.
President of the United States addressing the nation from the Oval Office in prime time for the first time in his presidency. The president not breaking new ground, repeating the various strains of argument that he has relied on since the earliest days of his campaign to claim that there is a wall that is needed on the southern border. In this case, he did not explicitly say Mexico will pay for it. He said the wall will pay for it. The wall will pay for the wall. It will pay for itself. The president also asserting that the southern border, in his words, is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs. The president's own Drug Enforcement Administration would say that is not the case. I would at least say that the president's proposed solution, a wall, would not stop the vast majority of hard drugs coming in, even those coming in from Mexican cartels. Those come in through ports of entry, and a wall would have nothing to do with whether or not those hard drugs stopped. Mainly, though, the president's speech was a litany of scare stories about immigrants being terrible criminals who are coming into the United States to rape and murder Americans, essentially, in the president's telling, for pleasure because it's in their nature. It's the sort of argument that the president made the very first day he came down that escalator in Trump Tower, and sort of shocked the Republican world when he announced that he would be running
for standing
the Republican nomination for president, in part because of the Mexican and in arguing the need for a government shutdown across the border. We're about to hear from Democrats, the top Democrats in Congress, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, in response. Briefly, before we get to that, Chris Hayes, heading into this speech tonight from the president, you and I were talking about whether or not this might be new ground. I heard it as the same thing he's always said.
Yes, although there was a lot more emphasis in that first part of the speech on the sort of threat inflation and creating he never, I don't even think said the word wall. He said barrier. There's a little bit of retreat from like the totemic wall thing and more of a focus on like, we've asked for this funding, can you give us this funding so we can move on? Which I think is them kind of signaling how they want this to end.
That's about 3.0. I mean, we were at steel slats 10 days ago, so I think we're just at a steel barrier. It changes every week. He doesn't seem to be able to keep track of what it is he's proposing on the southern border. I think that there are half a dozen things that were wrong, falsehoods, lies. and you talked about a lot of them before the speech and went through some of them now. But the big scam of the whole address was that there's a crisis. There's not a crisis. Border crossings at the southern border are at a 45-year low. I spoke to a former senior intelligence official today who said that it was his job to know where all the terrorists were, and there aren't any on the southern border. Yeah. So crime is a great issue for him, and he should tout crime, but he shouldn't lie about where it comes from.
Yeah, and literally, to your point, I mean, the first year of the Trump presidency, the apprehensions on the southern border were at a 45-year low. The number of apprehensions and crossings at the southern border has been dropping since the year 2000.
Which is great. I mean, if he wants to win, maybe he should run on that.
Democratic response now is coming up from Senator Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to the American people tonight about how we can end this shutdown and meet the needs of the American people. Sadly, much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts. The fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. But the president is rejecting these bipartisan bills which would reopen government over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall, a wall he always promised Mexico would pay for. The fact is, President Trump has chosen to hold hostage critical services for the health, safety, and well-being of the American people and withhold the paychecks of 800,000 innocent workers across the nation, many of them veterans. He promised to keep government shut down for months or years, no matter whom it hurts. That's just plain wrong. The fact is, we all agree we need to secure our borders while honoring our values. We can build the infrastructure and roads at our ports of entry. We can install new technology to scan cars and trucks for drugs coming into our nation. We can hire the personnel we need to facilitate trade and immigration at the border. We can fund more innovation to detect unauthorized crossings. The fact is, the women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government. Thank you. Leader Schumer?
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. My fellow Americans, we address you tonight for one reason only. The President of the United States, having failed to get Mexico to pay for his ineffective, unnecessary border wall, and unable to convince the Congress or the American people to foot the bill, has shut down the government. American democracy doesn't work that way. We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage. Tonight, and throughout this debate and throughout his presidency, President Trump has appealed to fear, not facts, division, not unity. Make no mistake, Democrats and the president both want stronger border security. However, we sharply disagree with the president about the most effective way to do it. So, how do we untangle this mess? Well, there's an obvious solution. Separate the shutdown from arguments over border security. There is bipartisan legislation supported by Democrats and Republicans to reopen government while allowing debate over border security to continue. There is no excuse for hurting millions of Americans over a policy difference. Federal workers are about to miss a paycheck. Some families can't get a mortgage to buy a new home. Farmers and small businesses won't get loans they desperately need. Most presidents have used Oval Office addresses for noble purposes. This president just used the backdrop of the Oval Office to manufacture a crisis, stoke fear, and divert attention from the turmoil in his administration. My fellow Americans, there is no challenge so great that our nation cannot rise to meet it. We can reopen the government and continue to work through disagreements over policy. We can secure our border without an ineffective, expensive wall. And we can welcome legal immigrants and refugees without compromising safety and security. The symbol of America should be the Statue of Liberty, not a 30-foot wall. So our suggestion is a simple one. Mr. President, reopen the government and we can work to resolve our differences over border security, but end this shutdown now. Thank you.
What amounts to a Democratic rebuttal of the president this evening. Again, the president's remarks tonight from the Oval Office are the first time that he has addressed the nation from the Oval Office in prime time. Presidents tend to reserve addresses like that for very serious matters. He will be giving a State of the Union address later on this month. This was not that, but like a State of the Union, the Democrats asked for essentially rebuttal time. Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, the newly elected House Speaker Nancy Pelosi standing side by side in a very serious tableau there, responding to the president, not point by point, but essentially trying to turn the focus from the president's claims that he needs a border wall to what he is holding hostage in order to try to get that, which is the shutdown of the federal government. Senator Schumer tonight closing by saying, our suggestion is a simple one, Mr. President, reopen the government and we can work to resolve our differences over border security. He said earlier in his remarks, there is an obvious solution, separate the shutdown from the arguments over border security. There is bipartisan legislation supported by Democrats and Republicans to reopen the government while allowing debate over border security to continue. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, echoing that same point, saying at the outset of her remarks, quote, the fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen the government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. So from the Democrats tonight, we're hearing, whatever you think about border security, Mr. President, we can fight about that. Let's reopen the government. Both Democrats and Republicans want that. You are the sticking point here, not leaders from either party. Nicole Wallace and Chris Hayes are here with me on set. Nicole, let me ask your response to that. It was, in some senses, typical partisan staging with the remarks from the president and then the response from the opposite party, but two very different sets of remarks.
Yeah, and listen, if you want to go to the politics of what they both said tonight, they were on the ballot 8 weeks ago. Donald Trump ran on that message in the midterms. He ran on the made-up caravan. He talked about, it was almost the same play. He doesn't have a lot of them, so he reran it. It didn't work in the midterms. His party was thumped, lost control of the House. And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer's message tonight was actually stronger than what they ran on in the midterms, because now they can add, not only are you wrong, but you've also, like an 8-year-old, taken your toys and gone home by closing the entire federal government. So I think if in politics, in Washington especially now, it's all zero sum. So if it's a seesaw, who went up and who went down, the power, the political potency of their message tonight is on the uprise. Donald Trump has already grabbed as many people as he can grab with those admittedly tragic stories of horrific crimes.
Chris.
Yeah, I thought that the sort of the difference in emphasis between the two is the most notable thing about the two addresses, right? Like, Donald Trump went out there and he read a Stephen Miller litany of horror stories, which he's been doing since day one.
In a nicer voice.
In a nicer voice, and I watched him do it in Cleveland, and it, you know, beheadings and rape, and I mean, it's awful stuff to hear. There's genuinely horrific things that have happened, but to conflate them with the 12 million people living here is a kind of incitement that's pretty ugly. But we've heard that, like Nicole said, that's been the deal.
It's a slightly different lists of crimes that evolves over time.
It updates. It gets updated.
It updates.
There are new crimes.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is this, you know, Office of Immigrant Crime stuff that he's been trying to sell from the very beginning. And the fact is that, I mean, we've said it before, we'll say it again, native-born Americans commit crimes at a higher rate than non-native-born immigrants. And
all crimes, violent crimes, driving infractions, speeding, all crimes.
And it is a demagogic old saw to try to pick out horrific things that you're going to attribute to one minority group, particularly one powerless minority group, in order to try to turn the majority against them. And the president is singing that same song. But it really is exactly the same script.
But it's literally the same. I mean, I felt like I was in Cleveland. I remember watching that litany in Cleveland and being somewhat horrified and shocked that this was what was being delivered. And to Nicole's point as well about the, you know, the point here, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a tweet about this a few days ago. She could be a guest later, basically saying, look, you want something then come and craft a bill and go through the process like everything else.
Yeah.
Like, lots of people want lots of things from the government, and we have debates about it, and you work with the committee chairs, and maybe you can work something out, but this is not the way you do it.
And here's the deal. He doesn't have public support. What he had as a candidate was that the base of the Republicans supported that strain of fear-mongering about illegal immigration. If he had public support, he'd have a bill, because members of Congress would support it. And I worked for a Republican president who addressed the nation over comprehensive immigration reform at the point where he had bipartisan support for it. President Obama should have been allowed to do the same thing in 2014, in my opinion. But this is a president with no bill. He doesn't even have all the Republicans on board, and he doesn't have the public behind him, so it boggles the mind.
Well, with each passing day, too, more Republicans peel off and say, let's get the government restarted. The more government, and it should be noted, as those Republicans peel off, both in the Senate and in the House, they're lining up with what is now the official Democratic Party position, which is, we'll talk about this in some rational way if you want to, but we have to reopen the government.
The other thing is, Cory Gardner, who is up in 2020 in the state of Colorado, which is increasingly a blue state, and who has made some noises about wanting to reopen the government. Cory Gardner will not be running for re-election in 2020 on the message that came from the Oval Office tonight.
No.
At 100%, he will get thumped if he tries, and he knows that.
Here's my question, though. We're talking about how the president is singing the same song that he's been singing all along. This is not different. He doesn't have any support. In fact, he probably has less support on this than he did before, particularly after the midterm elections. So why did he just do this? I mean, he didn't announce a national emergency so that he could use some sort of authority that he doesn't think he has otherwise to go build this thing. Why did this just happen?
Because I've covered immigration politics since back in McCain-Kennedy. I was at the May Day protest when the Sensenbrenner bill that would make it a felony to be here illegally started, and I've been covering it since then. And as long as I've been covering it, there is a veto point, which is the Steve Kings and the Stephen Millers of the world have more intensity on the issue than anyone else. And because of that intensity, even when President Bush and McCain and Kennedy got together to try to pass comprehensive reform, they've been able to kill it. And when it passed the Gang of Eight bill, they've been able to kill it. What he is relying on is the intensity of the sentiment among the people who feel flush about it.
It's a constant. There's nothing that has caused that to spike now, right? So he tried
But it's worked before. It's killed 2 bills.
He doesn't even care about the bill, though. I think it's, I don't disagree with any of that, but it's something simpler than that, more primal. I think it's because it's Trump, right? Before the holidays, a close Trump ally said, I said, what's he doing? It was the Maddow debacle, spiraling out of control. And I said, what's he doing? He said he lives in abject terror of his base and Robert Mueller. And so I think you can't control this one, right? You can't control what Robert Mueller's doing. But the base he can keep, the base feels that way, feels exactly as Chris just described. They feel that intensity, and so you can keep them ginned up.
But don't you, so the base intensity on this, though, is something that doesn't always respond to the same amount of stimulus, right? You have to keep upping it a little bit in order to keep it, right? And so there is no, I mean, there's the shutdown, but there's no new argument. There's no new evidence of support. There's no new, and the
shutdown may peel some of that off. There's also no data that I've seen that shows that the base that grows when you shut the government down. You may actually lose some because there's a lot of cross pressure with his base with the federal government shutdown.
And when you read the data out there, and both sort of anecdotally and in the actual public opinion data, I remember the last time that I saw the Republican base really engaged was in the Kavanaugh fight. They were unquestionably engaged. There was all kinds of data that showed it. They were there. I mean, I heard anecdotal, data of friends having fights with distant relatives they didn't realize were Republicans who were like, I don't like Trump, but what they're doing to Kavanaugh. That's not happening here.
No.
That we are not seeing any of that level of actual mobilization engagement of people outside of the smallest core.
Can I tell you what I think explains why the president did this? So the Democrats just won control of the House. The Democrats came back this past week, and it was like, whoa, the Democrats are the new protagonists in the Washington story, and everybody's covering all the new members being sworn in, and then the swearing in of Nancy Pelosi, and all the kids up there with her on the dais, and what are the Democrats going to do, and who are going to be the committee chairs, and what's their agenda, and the president was not getting talked about. And so the president summoned reporters to the White House to come see him do a White House press briefing in which he didn't take any questions from the press. And then there's, another day of coverage that's about the Democrats and what they're going to be doing in Washington and what they're demanding in their first day and all this stuff. And the president pulls another stunt and says, no, I actually need you to pay attention to me now. I'm going to be giving remarks now. I'm going to... And I honestly wonder if it just
attention.
occurred to him that he had never done an Oval Office address, and that's yet another thing he could do to turn the spotlight to himself, regardless of having anything to say.
And a friend of his has said at other points in the presidency that he is the sun king, and anything that obscures his access to the rays of sunlight drives him mad. So sort of like a mad king, he was there watching everything you described and said, well, you know, it also shows how shallow his view of the presidency is. Like, what other tricks do I have?
Yes.
What can I do?
I know, I'll do one of those cabinet meetings.
Plane?
Do we need to have a cabinet meeting about anything? No? Or is everybody around this table an acting secretary? Yes. Can we have the camera
say stuff about
not
me?
just for a spray, but for the entire hour and a half that I'd like them in here? I mean, how many more stunts are there?
But the difference here, what's so nuts about the situation is that a lot of times, you know, I always feel like he would rather be kind of a pundit that people paid attention to than the actual president. Like he wants to. He
wants Brian Kilmeade's job.
Yeah, he wants to give you his takes. The president's got takes. He wants to share his takes. He loves that the nation listens to his takes.
Correct.
But he doesn't really love running the country. But the thing is here, all of that kind of weird theatrics he does, the cabinet meeting, the government shut down.
That's exactly right.
So
people
nuts
are
about
suffering.
the situation.
Right. Like the thing with the cabinet room, it hurts us because we have to watch it and listen to it, but it doesn't hurt the country. You know, those people say ridiculous things about the dear leader, and they have to go home and face their wives or their kids. No one's hurt or injured in that exercise. People are hurting now. The economy will take a hit now. This is not funny anymore.
Chris Hayes, Nicole Wallace, my friends, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. As you said, Chris, I think aptly the best pundit point I have heard over the course of the entire day was, this is weird. This is actually truly weird, but having you guys here makes it better. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
You know, 3 days after the president was elected, the ACLU wrote a letter to newly elected Donald Trump asking him to please reconsider basically every major campaign promise he made, from mass deportation to the Muslim ban to banning abortion and greenlighting torture. They all struck the folks at the ACLU as being, according to their letter, quote, not simply un-American and wrong-headed, but also unlawful and unconstitutional. So they sent him this letter just after he was elected, 3 days after the election. Of course, Donald Trump didn't heed any of their advice. But the ACLU then considered him essentially to be warned. And after having asked him to rescind those policies and him refusing, the ACLU then proceeded to sue the pants off of him, taking literally dozens and dozens of legal actions against Trump and his administration, a huge number of which have involved immigrants and immigration policy. They sued over the original Muslim ban as well as the revised Muslim ban. When the Trump administration tried to force teen immigrant girls to give birth against their will, the ACLU sued over that. When the Trump administration started effectively kidnapping babies and kids from their parents at the southern border, taking them away forcibly, the ACLU sued to stop that. When the Trump administration tried to remove asylum protections from immigrant victims of gang violence and domestic violence, the ACLU sued them over that. Since day one of the Trump presidency, the ACLU has been at the forefront in terms of challenging and fact-checking the president's immigration policies. Joining us now is Omar Jadwat. He's the director of the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, and he just saw the president's remarks here while he was waiting to come on set with us. Mr. Jadwat, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Let me ask just your reaction to the content of the president's remarks, but also his choice to do this from the Oval Office tonight.
Sure. Well, I mean, you're not going to hear me say this very often. I think there was one kernel of truth in what the president said, and that was when he said that there's a humanitarian crisis at the border. Not a national security crisis. We've talked about, or you've talked about, all the ways in which that's transparently false, right? But there's a humanitarian crisis that he has created at the border. He's bottling up women and children in refugee camps in Mexico. He's continuing to run these shelters, not shelters is the wrong word, these detention facilities where people are kept in extremely cold ice boxes with nothing but an aluminum foil blanket. People are held out in the desert for hours and hours at a time with no medical attention. There's a huge range of things that this administration is not doing to address a real humanitarian crisis. When he gets up on TV and says there's a humanitarian crisis and the solution is a wall, the solution to women and children seeking safety in the United States is to close the doors to them being able to find protection from abuse. It's you know, it's a backwards world that he's living.
The president, he used that phrase, which actually is a well-wrought phrase. He said it's a crisis of the soul.
Right.
But what he was talking about as the crisis of the soul is the need to stop immigrant children. Literally, to stop the immigration of children over the southern border. I wonder if you are relieved at all with the president's decision tonight to not announce some sort of emergency. There'd been a lot of talk leading into this speech tonight that maybe the president was calling for an Oval Office address and doing this not just because he wanted to list the same complaints and horror stories about immigrants that he's been doing for years now, but instead because he wanted to announce something new, that he was going to claim new powers to address this under the president's authority that could be ascribed under some sort of emergency declaration. Are you relieved that he did not do that?
Well, look, I'm certainly glad that he's not trying to, at least at this point, in this way, override Congress, right? That's the essential problem with this whole emergency plan that he was talking about, was the idea that he would try to, because Congress won't pass the law he wants them to pass, won't give him the funding for the wall he wants to build, he's just going to go and do it on his own. That's exactly what he tried to do with this asylum ban that we sued him over, right? Congress passed a law that says you can seek asylum anywhere, between ports of entry, at ports of entry.